Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I'm Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific, you bet.
Thank you. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself and ask him some pertinent questions on the politics on the continent. And today we'll be talking a lot more about that. But in a moment, let's start off here at home. The campaign season, people are warming up for the campaign season. A lot of Democrats have jumped into the race for 2020. As of today, Bernie Sanders, former presidential candidate, weighed in, jumped into the race. Your take, Shaka.
Bernie Sanders was not a former presidential candidate, was he?
A former contender, one of the Democratic contenders.
He was basically what you'd call a presidential hopeful because he tried it during the primaries, and of course, you know what the rest of the story is. In fact, there are people who think that he could, in fact, have made it, and he probably could be the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, only because the Democratic Party decided to figure out a way of ensuring that Hillary Rodham Clinton had to be the flag bearer of the Democratic Party. And then, of course, as you know, she went on, and the rest, of course, is history.
What do you make of him coming back? What does he have to prove this time around?
I think that if, in fact, the Democratic Party could give him a nod, which they obviously didn't do last time, if they could actually give him a nod, because I can only see that his problem is if in fact he could win the Democratic Party primaries, because once he actually does, the general election will probably be a no-brainer. He probably just sails through, because guess what? His political opponent is going to be a man called President Donald Trump.
How about those who argue that there is no way he can become a Democratic candidate for president because he's not a Democrat, even though he rallies or he votes with Democrats?
I don't know.
He identifies himself as an independent.
I don't know about that because...
independent socialist.
At least we do know that 4 years ago, nobody actually said that. Nobody put those types of political roadblocks in his way. So I don't see really where that is going to come from. But if you want to go legal and what have you, I will remind you, Ndugu Paul Ndiho, that I am eminently underqualified for that particular role because I have never attended any law school.
Well, there are other candidates who have been in the field. For example, Kamala Harris is one of them. She seems to be doing very well. There are other several candidates who have come up, and their stories are yet to be told. Your take on some of the other candidates?
You are very much right. As a matter of fact, when you talk about Kamala Harris from a very junior senator, actually from California, an incredibly beautiful, smart, attractive human being. She could probably make a difference, but let's face it, she's pretty much tapping into the same issues that actually Bernie Sanders calls his own. In fact, the people that are running who happen to be on the Democratic political left of center, so to speak, are pretty much, pushing the same issues that, in fact, again, Bernie Sanders calls his staple. Bernie Sanders, first of all, when you talk about name identity, it is already there. It is true that there are some people who sometimes call him socialist and what have you, and socialism politically in a country like the United States of America is not a particularly good thing to be associated with, even though when you think about it, most states that form the Union, they have socialist aspects in terms of, for example, education, in terms of, for example, medical care, in terms of a lot of other things, housing and you name it. Those are socialist policies. But these are socialist policies that happen also to be in the context of a country that thrives on capitalism. America is not as a fair type of capitalism, the last time I checked. As a matter of fact, they do have, even the federal government has Medicaid, Medicare. These are, again, socialist type of policies, so to speak. So it's not about socialism. It's not about these labels of ideology. It's about whether or not you are putting people at the center. It is whether or not, in fact, people matter. And the issue here is social, economic, political justice.
Let's keep this focused on the elections. Let's switch from America to Africa. We have two upcoming elections. One that was supposed to happen last weekend. It didn't happen in Nigeria. And another one in Senegal. But let's start in Senegal. Let's go to a comment here from Rajabu Babu. Why did Nigeria postpone its elections?
To be very honest with you, Rajab, I do not know personally. I can only tell you based on what, for example, the authorities in Nigeria have said. The authorities said that they basically were not ready in terms of the infrastructure that they need in order to conduct an election that is deemed to be credible. And what is credible? Credible means that it has to be fair, it has to be free, it has to be transparent. So they didn't think that they would have actually an election that would meet those basic thresholds. And so they decided to buy a little bit more time, which of course translates into a week, so that by then, hopefully, they will be in a position to come up with an election that that will have results that are reflections of the will of the people who will come to vote that day.
Shaka, you just touched on a very interesting point there, saying that they needed more time to prepare. How much more time do you need? You've been preparing for this for 4 years.
I don't know, because we tend to run into those types of issues when it comes to election time in Africa. You know as well as I do that this is not the first time, for example, in the history of elections in Nigeria that you have had to postpone the election. You also know that it is not only Nigeria, when you think about the continent of Africa, that have actually been doing that. We just recently went through another election in a country that happens to be probably the largest in terms of land mass on the African continent. We're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. They did postpone an election, not once, twice, but eventually there was an election. Did it satisfy everybody? Of course not. But at the moment, I think it is a sort of process that is deemed, at least by both domestic and international community, to have been a sort of legitimate process that at the end of the day produced a new president that replaces former President Joseph Kabila. And it produced a new parliament and what have you. And the problem, of course, is, and people are asking, how long does it take to form a government? Can you imagine after today, Paul, they have not yet formed a government? Well,
they started formal talks, I think, over the weekend. The former president and the current president met to discuss the way forward.
And I think part of the reason, frankly, is that the former president, Joseph Kabila, seems to have a lot of say in this particular case. Because let's face it, there are people who actually think that Felix Tshisekedi did not, in fact, win the election on his own, that he was helped to win the election by former President Joseph Kabila. And they probably have a point, because look at it this way. Felix Tshisekedi wins the election. But when you come to the National Assembly, guess what? The majority, in fact, belongs to the party or the coalition of parties that are pretty much under President Joseph Kabila, which means the party that has a majority in the National Assembly has the opportunity to choose a prime minister who will be taking care of business, day-to-day type of business. It also has an opportunity to get some very important, strategic cabinet dockets, perhaps like, security, perhaps like mining, and who knows, my friend, perhaps even like finance.
Yeah, but Shaka, that particular election did not set a precedent. We've seen things like that happen, even including here in the United States when Barack Obama won re-election, he lost both houses of Congress. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Yeah, there are certain situations where those things happen, but I think the dynamics are totally different. Because you can't tell me, for example, why people who voted for a popular individual to become the new president, especially in places like the province of, Kasai, where Felix Tshisekedi, comes from. We're talking about Mbujimai, which I sometimes refer to as the diamond epicenter, or the global diamond capital, or what have you. But you find that, in fact, the members of parliament who come from there belong to a party that actually could not get the votes that were sufficient enough to elect a president.
But Shaka, you and I know that these things happen. We covered an election in Zimbabwe where the president, the current president, lost in most places, but he won the presidency. A lot of people focus on the presidency rather than the parliamentary seats.
I don't really think that Mr. Mnangagwa lost in most places. No, he actually controls parliament in Zimbabwe. So you can't say that he lost in most places.
Yeah, but I just gave an example of Zimbabwe.
Yeah,
but there are so many other
when
places.
you look at some of these elections, you also wonder whether, in fact, we are talking about elections or whether, in fact, we are talking about what some call selections. We're talking about an incumbent government in control of strategic institutions, for example. Institutions that sometimes determine who actually wins an election. We're talking about an institution, for example, that is made up of commissioners who are supposed to count the votes. And sometimes you have to look at how did they get there, who appointed them, and if they were appointed by the incumbent government, for example, is it possible, for example, that some of those individuals owe loyalty or allegiance to the people who appointed them? Because you're talking about most countries in Africa are democratically challenged. You have, of course, others will call it dictatorships and all that kind of stuff. You meet the members of security forces telling you they are arresting somebody, and as a journalist, when you ask them, why are you arresting so and so? And they are telling you, quote unquote, orders from above.
Let's go to another quicker comment here from Consequential Richie. He says, the election has been rigged already. What do you think about that postponement, Shaka?
I don't think that I agree with that particular individual talking about the election in Nigeria. I am sure he's talking about having been rigged. Where is the evidence? We need to have evidence. You have to have evidence and make sure that that evidence has legs to walk. Until and unless you are able to do that, I am not going to side with you. I think we should give the benefit of the doubt to the Nigerian authorities who are in charge of the elections and see what happens next Saturday. It's quite possible that, the people who are in control of the state, and we are talking about a Major General Muhammadu Buhari, it's quite possible that his intelligence sources may have probably seen that he wasn't going to retain the residence of Aso Rock in Abuja. And therefore, they needed to buy a little bit of time so that they could come about with some kind of acceptable or something to be seen as a legitimate way of, quote unquote, creative accounting. It's quite possible.
Interesting. That brings me to another comment from Sakina Andrew. Why should the citizenry go to vote when almost all our elections are marred with corruption and all that, especially in light of what you just talked about, trying to do some creative accounting?
I think part of the problem is that even though all politicians will always tell you that power belongs to the people, and in fact, the sovereign is supposed to be made up of the people, ordinary people, middle class, and what have you. But in fact, at the end of the day, when you look at the political realities, especially again, in countries which are politically and democratically challenged, power does not belong to the people. Power belongs to the elite few who control the systems in place. And then not until, for example, there is sufficient civic education to the extent that the ordinary person really knows what his or her powers are, knows that he or she is the person, in fact, who employs the president, is the person who employs the ambassador, is the person who employs the chief justice, and all these big government, officials who pretty much really live off the backs of the majority of the taxpayers. So it isn't until you are going to have a sort of critical mass in the sense that you have people who know exactly where power belongs, people who owe allegiance to the state, and in return, they definitely have what they would call constitutional rights, inalienable rights, if you will, in fact, political birthrights. Not until people are aware of what is going on around their neighborhoods and stuff like that, is there going to be a situation where they are going to get a fair shake, a fair share of what happens, in the sense that they will be in a position to determine who governs them and how they are governed. As we talk, most countries in the African continent are not really being governed. They are being ruled, and they are being ruled by the guys that have the power. And these guys have the power, and they do whatever they want because, given that they do not, in fact, depend on what we would call election, they depend rather on selection. They don't feel like they owe anything to the electorate.
Yeah, how about people who argue that, for example, in Senegal, you talked about countries that are democratically challenged, but this is a country that is maybe democratically empowered. They have had at least occasions where there's been peaceful transfers of power. And I'm not talking about one time, but more than 2 times at least. We have a president who cut his term from 7 years to 5 years. How about that?
Very interesting. By the way, as you rightly say, Senegal is a very, very interesting and rare example of where democracy is and where democracy works. But you see, democracy at the end of the day also has got some challenges. It also has some problems. Look at a country like the United States of America. It is a very highly democratic, politically respected entity. And yet, you also do have some political problems in this country. You can talk about, for example, what they call political gerrymandering. You have sometimes situations where the party in control of the houses on Capitol Hill, the control of the White House and what have you, sometimes actually goes around the laws in a manner that gives them some kind of disproportional advantage. That is called gerrymandering. And this is a country, sincerely, that has very, very respectable democratic credentials. There's no question about it. So, yeah, there are some problems in Senegal. But let's face it.
Like, for example, 2 opposition leaders who are refused, who are barred from running in this presidential campaign, despite the fact that we have 5 contestants, men contestants for the presidency, but 2 were barred from running in this presidential election. Isn't that also contradicting what you just talked about?
Well, first of all, it also depends on how they were bad. If they were, for example, bad because they were found to have violated some laws and all that kind of stuff, there's nothing much you can do about it. Because let's face it, Senegal is one of those respected democratic countries, not only in Africa, but in the world. They have 3 branches of government, for example. They have an independent judiciary, which is led, obviously, by the President of the National Assembly. They have an independent, that is an independent legislature. They have an independent judiciary, which has obviously a person who is in charge of the Constitutional Court. I think the French system is called the Constitutional Court. And for the British or the Anglo-citizen, it's called the Chief Justice. So these are people, frankly, who are not subordinate to the executive, which is headed by, in most cases, a president, who also happens to be commander-in-chief of the country's armed forces and all kind of stuff. So if, in fact, those people were bad by the judiciary system, the court system and what have you, you have to give it the benefit of the doubt. But politics being what it is, anything is possible, because guess what? One of the key definitions of politics, Paul, is that politics, in fact, is the art of all possibilities. And in the context of the art of all possibilities, anything is possible.
Speaking about the art of all possibilities, there is a young, remarkable guy who is giving the incumbent a run for his money. His name is, he's a newcomer, Osman Sonko. He's 45 years old, a former activist, corruption activist. He ran for parliament and won. You could argue that maybe this could be the year young people are standing up to these to the establishment, or telling these old guys that, hey, you know what, we are around the corner, we want to be part of the process.
Oh yeah, and I think that Senegal is democratic enough to allow those types of things to happen. You even talked about the incumbent president, Macky Sall. Macky Sall is obviously one of Africa's new breed of African leaders. Not the type that had actually been anointed by the Bill Clinton administration, obviously, along with people like former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and all that kind of stuff, because they talked about a new breed of African leaders who were expected to be the beacons of hope for African democracy. And they began with Isaias Afwerki in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea. Do you see any democracy in Asmara? They moved south to Ethiopia. And Meles Zenawi, who happened to be prime minister at the time, unfortunately he has since died and what have you, but he didn't leave the country with a democracy.
You could argue that he ushered in what we have there.
You could say that thanks to him, perhaps, you have a new kid on the block who actually is a reflection of what is likely to be another new breed of African leaders, Abiy Ahmed. Then you go down south to where a guy like you and I come from, Uganda. You have a gentleman called General Yoweri Museveni. Museveni certainly is not a poster boy for democracy. Then you go to Rwanda. You begin to wonder whether, in fact, what is happening there is political democracy or democratic process. They have elections, yes, but you know what? Some people say that those types of elections are reflections of a sort of political military operation.
Where a person wins with 100%.
That is correct.
Okay, let's go to, somebody is asking you a personal question here. From Ariho Robert Kahinji. What have you contributed towards development of your country as a seasoned journalist, Shaka?
It's very interesting. I think that as a seasoned journalist, Robert, my answer is very simple. First of all, as a journalist, your job is to make public officials accountable. If anything, I think I'm probably accused for being a little bit harsh in terms of requiring the Ugandan authorities to account for their actions. So I have definitely done that. And frankly, on a personal level, as a journalist, I have to say that I am a very lucky guy, very happy in the sense that I have had some very interesting highs. In fact, I can claim, without perhaps hoping to be contradicted, that a guy called Ndiho, who is seated right opposite me, right here, who has the privilege of asking me the tough questions and what have you, was actually inspired by a guy called Shaka.
That's correct. That's correct.
At Makerere University. And the last time I checked, you now work for an international or a global respectable media, the Voice of America. I can also talk about a man called Julius Muchunguzi, who happens to be a senior media advisor for the Ugandan Prime Minister, Dr. Ruhakana Rugunda. Previously, he worked as a senior public official at the Commonwealth Secretariat, Marlborough House, London. There are so many people I can talk about. I just got an email recently from Los Angeles, California, from a gentleman called Douglas Mujisha, who said that what he has become, he has been able to do it precisely because of the seeds that were planted by whom he said was Mike Sully, when I still had the slave name Mike, that has since been, of course, replaced by Shaka. This was when I had just completed my PhD program at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, back in 1988. I was able to make things very simple for him, encourage and motivate him. And he has since been able to do that, and he has written me, thanking me for what I did. I have also been thanked by a founding publisher and editor of a New York-based Black Stars newsletter, Milton Alimadi, a graduate of the famous Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He talks about how Shaka has been somebody who is his inspiration, inspired him for many years. There are so many people that say that. If you are talking about development, meaning that you have to have a physical infrastructure of things on the ground, like a road from Kabale, for example, to Lake Bunyonyi, I'm afraid I'm eminently underqualified for that. There are other people who hold those types of positions in Uganda who have the power to make that happen. I can only remind them in my position as a journalist. If I have failed to remind some of these people, maybe I have failed in my role. But so far, I seem to be, in fact, firing on 4 cylinders.
Well, I can attest to the fact that you've inspired so many of us, if not so many in the hundreds or thousands, probably millions of people have traveled with you across the continent and have witnessed how young people come to you saying that if it wasn't for you telling them what to do or inspiring them, they would not have done what they do today. On that note, I thank you so much for being a great guest and continue inspiring many more young people across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.